What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to my channel. Today I've got 3 real stories that happened during the summer months. These aren't your typical campfire tales. These are genuine accounts from people who lived through some seriously messed up situations when the weather was warm and people were supposed to be having fun. Before we jump in, if you enjoy this type of content, hit that like button and subscribe for more horror stories every week. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming up. This first story comes from a guy named Kieran who was 19 at the time. It happened in rural Oregon during July of 2018. Kieran had just finished his freshman year of college and was back home for the summer, working at a local hardware store. The town he grew up in was one of those places where everyone knew everyone, population maybe 3,000 people, surrounded by dense pine forests and winding back roads. There was this swimming spot about 15 minutes outside town that all the locals knew about. It wasn't marked on any maps or tourist guides, just a wide section of creek where the water was deep enough to jump in from the rocky ledges above. The trees formed a natural canopy overhead, keeping the area cool and shaded even on the hottest days. Kieran had been going there since he was a kid, usually with friends, but this particular afternoon he decided to go alone. It was a Wednesday, middle of the week, so he figured he'd have the place to himself. He parked his beat-up Honda on the dirt road and hiked the quarter-mile trail through the woods. When he got to the swimming hole, he noticed a car he didn't recognize, a white sedan with out-of-state plates. But he didn't see anyone around, so he figured maybe someone had gone for a hike on one of the other trails. Kieran stripped down to his swim shorts and dove in. The water was perfect, probably around 70 degrees. He floated on his back for a while, just enjoying the quiet. That's when he heard voices coming from upstream. 2 men emerged from around the bend, walking along the creek bank. They looked to be in their 40s, both wearing jeans and t-shirts, not exactly swimming attire. One was tall and skinny with a scraggly beard. The other was shorter and stockier with a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. They spotted Kieran in the water and waved. The tall one called out, "Beautiful day for a swim, isn't it?" Kieran treaded water and nodded politely. Something felt off about these guys, but he couldn't put his finger on what exactly. Maybe it was the way they were both staring at him, or how they made no move to leave despite clearly not being there to swim. "You from around here?" the shorter one asked, sitting down on a fallen log near where Kieran had left his clothes. "Yeah, born and raised," Kieran replied, starting to swim toward the opposite bank, away from them. "We're just passing through," the tall one said. "Heard about this place from someone back in town. Real secluded spot." The way he said secluded made Kieran's skin crawl. These weren't tourists or fellow swimmers. They had sought out this isolated location for a reason. Kieran climbed out of the water on the far side, putting the creek between himself and the 2 men. "Well, I was just heading out anyway," he said, trying to keep his voice casual. But his clothes and car keys were on the other side, right where the men were sitting. "Don't leave on our account," the shorter one said, picking up Kieran's shirt and examining it. "We were hoping to get to know some of the locals." Kieran's heart started pounding. He was a decent athlete, played baseball in high school, but he was outnumbered and basically naked. The nearest house was probably 2 miles through thick forest. "Actually, my friends are meeting me here any minute," Kieran lied. "Big group coming." The 2 men exchanged a look. The tall one stood up and started walking toward the creek. "Is that right? Well, we'll just wait around and meet them too." That's when Kieran noticed the shorter one had pulled something from his pocket, a folding knife, which he was casually cleaning his fingernails with. Kieran made a decision. Instead of trying to cross back over for his clothes, he turned and ran into the woods, barefoot and wearing only swim shorts. Branches tore at his skin as he crashed through the underbrush, but he didn't stop until he reached the main road. A passing motorist found him there 20 minutes later, a local woman who recognized him and gave him a ride to the police station. When officers went back to check the swimming hole, the white sedan was gone, along with Kieran's clothes, wallet, and car keys. His Honda was found 3 days later in a Walmart parking lot 60 miles away. His wallet was empty, but everything else was still in the car, including a Polaroid photo that hadn't been there before, a picture of the swimming hole, taken from the exact spot where Kieran had been floating. The two men were never identified or caught. If you're enjoying these stories so far, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss what's coming next. This second story happened to a woman named Thessaly during the summer of 2019. She was 28, working as a nurse at a hospital in suburban Phoenix, Arizona. Thessaly had just bought her first house, a small two-bedroom place in what seemed like a quiet neighborhood. Lots of young families, well-maintained yards, the kind of area where people walked their dogs in the evening and kids rode bikes in the street. The house next door was occupied by an elderly man named Beauregard Tibbs. He was probably in his 70s, retired, and from what Thessaly could tell, he spent most of his time working in his yard or sitting on his front porch. He seemed harmless enough, always waved when she got home from work, made small talk about the weather. But as the summer progressed, Thessaly started noticing things that made her uncomfortable. It began with Beauregard being outside every time she came home, no matter what time of day or night. At first she thought it was coincidence, but after a few weeks, she realized he was always positioned where he could see her driveway. Then she noticed he'd moved a lawn chair to the side of his house that faced her bedroom window. He claimed he liked to sit there in the evenings because it caught the best breeze, but Thessaly's bedroom was on the second floor. There was no way a breeze would be better up there. The real wake-up call came in late July. Thessaly worked rotating shifts at the hospital, including overnight shifts that ended at 7 a.m. When she got home one morning, exhausted and ready to sleep, she noticed something odd about her bedroom curtains. They were positioned differently than she'd left them. Not closed, but adjusted so there was a gap she was certain hadn't been there before. Thessaly lived alone and always kept her doors locked. She searched the house but found no signs of forced entry. Still, the feeling that someone had been inside while she was at work was overwhelming. She decided to test her theory. Before leaving for her next overnight shift, she carefully arranged small objects on her dresser and nightstand in specific positions. A bottle of perfume angled just so, a book placed at the edge of the table, coins stacked in a particular order. When she returned the next morning, everything had been moved. Subtly but definitely moved. Thessaly installed a small security camera in her bedroom, hidden behind some books on a shelf. She didn't tell anyone about it, not even her family. She just wanted to know if she was losing her mind or if someone was actually entering her house. The footage from the third night made her blood run cold. At 2:47 a.m., while Thessaly was at work, her bedroom door slowly opened. Beauregard Tibbs stepped inside, moving carefully in the dark. He stood at the foot of her bed for nearly 10 minutes, just staring at where she would normally be sleeping. Then he walked to her dresser and methodically went through her things. Not stealing anything, just touching and examining her personal items. The most disturbing part was how comfortable he seemed. Like this wasn't his first time. Thessaly called the police the next day, but when they confronted Beauregard, he denied everything. He claimed he'd never set foot in her house, suggested maybe she was sleepwalking or having some kind of breakdown from work stress. Without evidence of forced entry, the police said there wasn't much they could do beyond filing a report and suggesting Thessaly change her locks. But Thessaly had saved the security footage. She showed it to the officers, expecting immediate action. Instead, they informed her that the recording might not be admissible in court since it was taken without Beauregard's consent. Arizona is a two-party consent state for recordings. The very evidence that proved her nightmare was real could potentially get her in legal trouble instead of him. The detective handling the case was sympathetic but explained the complications. They could pursue charges, but a good defense attorney might get the evidence thrown out, and Beauregard could potentially sue Thessaly for illegally recording him. Thessaly ended up moving out before the end of August, breaking her lease and losing her security deposit. She couldn't sleep in that house knowing Beauregard had been watching her, touching her things, standing over where she slept. 6 months later, she got a call from the detective. The woman who moved into Thessaly's old house had reported similar incidents. This time, Beauregard had been caught on a neighbor's security camera climbing through a back window. Turned out he'd been doing this for years, to multiple women in the neighborhood. The police had received reports before, but nothing concrete enough to build a case on. Beauregard Tibbs was finally arrested and charged with multiple counts of burglary and stalking. During the search of his house, police found collections of personal items belonging to various women, jewelry, underwear, photos, even strands of hair. Thessaly never found out exactly how long he'd been entering her house before she caught him. This final story comes from a guy named Xerxes, and it happened during a small-town summer festival in rural Kentucky, August of 2020. Now, you have to understand this was during the height of the pandemic, so most large events had been canceled that year. But this particular town, I won't name it, but it's one of those places where everyone knows everyone, and they weren't too concerned about following state guidelines. Decided to go ahead with their annual summer festival anyway. Xerxes was 24, had recently moved to the area for work. He was an outsider, didn't know many people, but figured the festival would be a good chance to meet some locals and get a feel for the community. The festival was set up in the town square, maybe 20 booths selling food and crafts, a small stage for local bands, games for kids, pretty typical small-town stuff. The population was probably 800 people, so an event like this would draw folks from several surrounding communities. Xerxes went alone on Saturday evening, grabbed some barbecue and walked around checking out the different booths. The atmosphere was friendly enough, people were polite, asked where he was from, the usual small talk. But as the evening went on, he started noticing something strange. Conversations would stop when he approached. Not in an obvious way, but people would shift topics or lower their voices. He caught fragments of discussions that didn't make sense, references to the selection and this year's turn. Around 9 p.m., most of the families with young kids started heading home, but the crowd didn't really thin out. If anything, more people seemed to be arriving. Adults who hadn't been there earlier, coming from the surrounding farmland and back roads. A man named Pastor Cornelius, who apparently ran the local church, approached Xerxes near the pie booth. He was a big guy, probably 6 feet 4 inches, with calloused hands and a too friendly smile. "You're the new fellow working at the grain elevator, right?" Pastor Cornelius asked. Xerxes confirmed that yes, that was him. "Well, we're real glad to have you in our community," Pastor Cornelius continued. "In fact, some of us were hoping you'd participate in a special tradition we have here. Something we do every year at the festival." Before Xerxes could ask what kind of tradition, Pastor Cornelius placed a heavy hand on his shoulder and guided him toward the edge of the square, where a group of maybe 15 adults had gathered in a loose circle. "See, every summer, we select someone new to the community to help us with a little ceremony," Pastor Cornelius explained. "It's an honor, really. Goes back generations in this town." The people in the circle were all staring at Xerxes now. Men and women ranging from their 30s to their 70s. All with the same expectant expression. One of the women was holding what looked like a wooden box. "What kind of ceremony?" Xerxes asked, every instinct telling him to get out of there. "Oh, it's real simple," said an older woman with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. "We just need you to draw from the box here. Whatever you pull determines your role in the harvest blessing." She opened the wooden box, revealing what looked like folded pieces of paper. "Harvest blessing?" Xerxes asked. "For the crops," Pastor Cornelius said. "We've been having the best yields in the county for over 40 years. Never had a bad season, never lost a harvest. This little tradition is how we keep that streak going." The woman with the box stepped forward. "Go ahead, son. Just pick one." Something about the whole situation felt completely wrong. The way they were all watching him, the isolation of being led away from the main crowd, the vague references to traditions and ceremonies. "You know what, I think I'm going to head home," Xerxes said, trying to step back. But Pastor Cornelius's hand tightened on his shoulder. "Now, don't be rude. This is how we welcome new folks. Everyone participates. Everyone who stays," added another man. And there was something in his tone that made Xerxes' stomach drop. Xerxes looked around the circle. These weren't friendly neighbors anymore. These were people who had cornered him, isolated him from witnesses, and were insisting he participate in something he didn't understand. "I really need to get going," Xerxes said more firmly, and this time he shrugged off Pastor Cornelius's hand and started walking back toward the main festival area. Several of the people in the circle moved to follow him, but Pastor Cornelius held up a hand to stop them. "Let him go," Pastor Cornelius said loud enough for Xerxes to hear. "Some folks just aren't ready to be part of a real community." Xerxes didn't stop walking until he reached his car. As he drove away, he could see the group still gathered in their circle, watching his tail lights disappear. The next Monday at work, his supervisor, a guy named Lazarus who'd lived in the area his whole life, asked how Xerxes had enjoyed the festival. "It was interesting," Xerxes said carefully. "Some people wanted me to participate in some kind of ceremony." Lazarus's expression changed immediately. "What kind of ceremony?" Xerxes described the encounter with Pastor Cornelius and the group with the wooden box. Lazarus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You did the right thing leaving." "What do you mean?" "That tradition they were talking about," Lazarus said, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "It's not what they make it sound like." Lazarus explained that every few years, when someone new moved to town, someone without local family or connections, they'd get invited to participate in the harvest blessing. But the people who drew the wrong piece of paper from that box had a habit of disappearing before the next festival. "Disappearing how?" Xerxes asked. "Just gone," Lazarus said. "Moved away suddenly, according to Pastor Cornelius. But their cars would still be at their houses, their stuff still in their apartments. And somehow their jobs would already be filled by the time anyone thought to ask questions." Lazarus told him about a guy named Dmitri who'd moved to town 3 summers earlier. Young, single, worked at the hardware store. He'd been invited to participate in the ceremony, and according to the official story, he'd drawn the honor piece, whatever that meant, and then decided to leave town the next day to fulfill his obligation to the community. But Dmitri had left behind a month's rent, a full refrigerator, and a dog that was found tied up in his backyard, nearly dead from dehydration. "So what actually happens to them?" Xerxes asked. Lazarus just shook his head. "I don't know, and I don't want to know. But I can tell you this, the families that run this town, the ones who've been here for generations, they take their traditions real seriously. And their crops never fail, their businesses never struggle, their kids never get into serious trouble." Xerxes quit his job 2 weeks later and moved back to Louisville. He never found out what was written on those pieces of paper, or what happened to the people who drew the wrong one. But every summer since then, he's checked the local newspaper from that town online. And every year, there's a brief mention of the successful harvest festival, and a small obituary section that always seems to include 1 or 2 people who moved away to pursue new opportunities. People with no local family, no deep community ties. People just like Xerxes had been.